In the spring of 1873, a U.S. Marshal traveling alone through the Choctaw Nation came across a chilling scene. 17 bodies laid out in a perfect ring around a dying campfire. Each man had been shot once between the eyes, and each clutched a playing card from the same deck. The marshal counted twice before the message sank in. Among the dead were Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own office in Fort Smith, Arkansas, men who had ridden out 6 weeks earlier on a single mission: to capture or kill the man newspapers were calling the Black Devil of the Red River. Like every posse before them, they had failed. The cards in their hands formed a coded message the marshal recognized, but couldn't decipher. A code that wouldn't be cracked for another 41 years. Long after anyone who understood it was gone, buried in unmarked graves scattered across 3 states and Indian Territory. What the marshal didn't know, and what no white lawman would understand for decades, was that their quarry had once been a slave, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi, for $940 to a cotton planter who branded him on the left shoulder with J.W. and sent him to the fields at age 11. Before we go further into the story of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly broke the U.S. government in the years after the Civil War, do me a favor, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from tonight. What you're about to hear stayed buried in classified federal records for over a century, and the descendants of those involved, still living in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas, never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're telling it anyway. To understand how a former slave became the most feared outlaw leader on the American frontier, you have to understand the country that shaped him. A nation that had just torn itself apart over whether men like him were human or property. The war ended in April 1865, but along the western edge of the former Confederacy, where Texas met Indian Territory and Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war never truly ended. It just changed form. The Union Army pulled most of its troops to occupy the deeper South, leaving behind a lawless stretch nearly the size of France, patrolled by fewer than 200 federal officers. Into that vacuum poured every desperate soul the war had spawned. Confederate guerrillas who wouldn't surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder. Comanche and Kiowa raiders pushed off their hunting grounds. Mexican vaqueros displaced by Anglo cattle barons. Chinese railroad laborers left friendless in a hostile country. And tens of thousands of freedmen with nowhere to go and nothing but the clothes on their backs, walking west because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. Boggy Depot sat at the heart of this chaos, about 40 miles north of the Red River in the Choctaw Nation. In the autumn of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved. The buildings were thrown together from green cottonwood that warped as it dried, giving the whole town a crooked, drunken look. There were 3 saloons, 2 owned by a Choctaw merchant named Pushmataha Folsom, who'd grown rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war and saw no reason to stop now. A single store run by a Scottish trader, Angus McRae, who kept a shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top, and was known to settle disputes with whichever was closer at hand. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lithorsmen could muster, which was less and less often as the territory slid deeper into disorder. Boggy Depot wasn't so much a town as a wound that had scarred over badly on the surface while festering underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from Texas, carrying men with no names and goods with no provenance. Wagons rolled out toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to someone else. The graveyard on a small rise behind the abandoned Methodist mission had grown by 47 graves in the 18 months since the war ended. Only 9 from natural causes. The rest died of what folks called lead poisoning, rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife, a back, and a moonless night. The Choctaw Lithorsman had ridden through twice in the past year, both times after killings embarrassing enough to demand attention. Both times they questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and rode away, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own accounts. The mission building still stood at the town's western edge, roof half collapsed, heavy oak doors hanging open, children playing among broken pews and shattered pulpit, occasionally finding a torn hymn page or a fragment of stained glass someone had shot at. The town smelled of horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, cheap whiskey, and beneath it all, the faint, persistent odor of old blood soaked into the earth of certain alleys, unreachable by rain. Into this town, on a cold November morning in 1866, walked a black man of about 26 foot, too lean as a coyote, wearing a Union cavalry coat with a corporal's chevron still on the sleeve, a wide-brimmed slouch hat pulled low over slate, gray eyes. He carried a Spencer carbine across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers on his hips in a cross, draw rig he'd made himself from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles from the Texas border through country where a black man traveling alone was usually considered fair game for anyone wanting his weapons or his life. He hadn't been bothered, and the reasons why would become clear to Boggy Depot's people in the months ahead. His name, he told Angus McCrae when he came in to buy salt pork and coffee, was Jeremiah Walker. He'd served 3 years in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, fought at Honey Springs, been wounded twice, and mustered out at Fort Leavenworth in 1865 with a discharge paper, a back pay voucher the Army refused to honor, and the brand of his former owner still visible on his left shoulder. McCrae sized him up, saw the way Walker stood with his back to the corner and his eyes on the door, recognized a man who'd long since decided he'd never be taken alive, and counted out the goods without comment, even threw in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McCrae was old and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from St. Louis that he'd known the moment Walker walked in that the country was about to change, though he had no idea how much. The fragments of Walker's early life, recovered mostly through the painstaking work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s, paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being, but which somehow, through accident and ferocious will, produced the opposite. He was born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on so-called scientific principles, meaning he'd read agricultural journals and concluded that productivity could be maximized by breaking families apart and selling children when they reached working age, on the theory that workers without family ties were less likely to escape and more focused on their tasks. Walker's mother, listed only as Hannah in the plantation ledgers, was sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez, allowed brief, tightly controlled visits, and who disappeared from local records in 1853, possibly murdered, possibly fled. At 11, Walker was sold to a Louisiana cotton planter whose initials were burned into his shoulder, and who treated him with a casual brutality that was By the standards of the time, neither unusual nor noteworthy. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war, making his way north through Mississippi's swamps to Union lines, eventually to a recruiting station in Kansas, enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years, learning to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later remember him in a memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man he'd ever encountered, with a memory that retained everything that would tackle that would have made him a senior officer in any army that allowed black men to wear officers' insignia. The Union Army didn't allow that. Walker was discharged as a corporal, having been recommended for promotion to sergeant 3 times, and denied each time on grounds of regulation. What happened over the next 18 months in the territory between the Red and Canadian rivers is documented in fragments. In Choctaw Lythorseman records, federal marshals' dispatches from Fort Smith, private correspondence of Texas cattlemen, and oral histories black families in eastern Oklahoma still tell their children, though now quietly, because the descendants of those who hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those same counties, and old grudges have a way of outliving the men who conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled a band so improbable in its composition that federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker, including a Tennessean named Castile Pettigrew, a regimental scout who could read sign on Bear Rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors, led by a man called Tabanaka, Sound of the Sun, who'd lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864, and saw the alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip, Ignacio, Raymond, and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo-vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, and who brought the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas, who'd ridden with William Quantrill, and had no place in the post-war world. A Missourian named Ellis Tatum, and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Horton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who'd been enslaved by a Choctaw planter before the war, and now served as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which federal records found particularly hard to accept. A black woman of about 25 named Delia Ransom, who'd escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, where she learned to handle a pistol with both hands and read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode as an equal, planned several of the band's most successful raids, and was, according to the only surviving photograph, a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was actually in front of her. The gang didn't steal cattle, which is what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity, easily organized against, easily hunted by cattlemen's associations and stock detective agencies. What Jeremiah Walker's band stole was money, in quantities no frontier outlaw had previously imagined possible. Their first major operation, in April 1868, was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which was pushing its line west across Indian Territory. The wagon carried 28,000 in Union greenbacks, intended for construction crews, guarded by 12 armed men, including 4 Pinkerton agents brought in specifically because the railroad anticipated trouble. The wagon was struck at 3 in the morning by a force the surviving guards estimated at 30 riders. Though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes. 3 guards were killed, including 2 Pinkertons. The rest were stripped of their weapons and tied to trees. The money was loaded onto pack mules and carried east into the Kiamichi Mountains, disappearing into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was ever recovered. The surviving guards, when they were finally able to give coherent statements at Fort Smith, described an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There had been no shouted demands, no warning shots, no announcement of intentions, just a sudden silence. The kind that falls on a forest when a predator enters, the silence of every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon collapsed simultaneously, killed by 2 perfectly placed rifle shots fired from more than 300 yards by marksmen the guards never saw. Then the riders emerged from the timber on both sides of the road at a slow walk, faces covered with dark cloth, guns held at the ready, but not pointed at anyone in particular. The way a man holds a gun when he's so certain of his ability to use it that he feels no need to threaten. 3 guards, including the senior Pinkerton, tried to draw their weapons. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement by riders no one saw aim. The rest raised their hands. They were ordered. In a calm voice one guard later described as sounding like a country schoolteacher addressing a particularly slow class. To dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind the trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, and any small valuables, watches, rings, personal cash, were pointedly left untouched. Only the company money was taken. One guard, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania on his first Western assignment, began to cry, and one of the masked riders dismounted, walked over, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted his shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By the time a passing freight wagon found them at dawn, the guards had been tied to their trees for nearly 5 hours. The only thing any of them could agree on with certainty was that their attackers hadn't been ordinary outlaws. They had been soldiers, the kind who'd survived the war by becoming better at killing than the people trying to kill them, and then decided, for reasons no one understood, to keep going. What disturbed the Pinkerton agency more than the loss of the money was the discovery that each of the surviving guards had been tagged with a small piece of paper pinned to his shirt, all reading the same careful schoolmaster's hand. "We could have killed you. We chose not to. Tell your masters that the next time the choice will be different." The Pinkerton agency didn't know what to do with that. The agency had been founded 20 years earlier by a Scottish abolitionist, Alan Pinkerton, who'd run safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and in his younger days would probably have understood Jeremiah Walker better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force for the railroads and Eastern banking interests, and his agents were instructed to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy, to bring its members in alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who'd risen through the agency by being smarter and more ruthless than those around him, and he understood from the beginning that this wouldn't be an ordinary chase. He arrived at Fort Smith in May 1868, sat down with the federal marshal there, a former Union general named James Fagan, and asked one question. "How does a man hide 20 riders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, settler, and passing teamster will report a strange face within a day. Fagan didn't have an answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it finally became apparent 2 years later, would shock the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth out of newspapers for the rest of the century. Jeremiah Walker wasn't hiding. He was being protected by a network of people across 3 states and Indian Territory who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Walker was doing was something that needed to be done. The first hint of this network came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Kiamichi Mountains for months with the apparent knowledge and cooperation of the Choctaw Light Horsemen, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated, found the informant murdered 3 days after he filed his report. His body left in the middle of Dokesville's main street, with a single playing card pinned to his chest. The King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened to bring in federal troops, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College, who'd once translated the Bible into Choctaw, looked at him with the patient contempt of a man who'd been dealing with white officials his entire life, and said only that the Choctaw Nation was a sovereign government under the treaties of 1866, that federal troops couldn't enter without Choctaw consent, and that consent would not be given. The implication was clear. Walker had the protection of the Choctaw government, or at least enough of its officials, to make that protection effective. Donovan returned to Fort Smith and sent a long telegram to Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. The response from Allen Pinkerton himself, a copy of which survives in the agency's archives, was one of the strangest documents in American law enforcement history. It instructed Donovan to proceed with the investigation, but to use particular discretion in any actions that might bring the matter to public attention. Pinkerton, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand that something complicated was happening on the southwestern frontier, something that didn't fit neatly into law and crime categories, and he was reluctant to bring the full weight of his agency down on it without first knowing what he'd be destroying. If you're still listening, take a moment to hit that like button. The algorithm only shows this kind of buried American history to people who actively engage with it, and the families who've spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, comment, and share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Kiamichi Mountains, leave it in the comments, because what we're about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, hitting a stagecoach carrying gold from the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government owed under the 1866 treaty and had finally agreed to pay in coin rather than depreciated paper currency. The coach carried 19,000 in gold double eagles, guarded by a detachment of the 6th U.S. Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out, 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles on both sides of the road, and the gold was taken. But that wasn't what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next within 2 weeks. Every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the nation had received, by means no investigation could ever trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly 20 in gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen. With a small remainder, the freedmen insisted had been used to buy schoolbooks for their children. Federal investigators who interviewed these families found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who'd brought the gold or how it had arrived. The pouches simply appeared on doorsteps in the night, with no note, no explanation. Pressed, the freedmen said only that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and looked at the federal agents with expressions that combined politeness, patience, and a deep ancient amusement the agents found impenetrable. Patrick Donovan understood when he read the reports exactly what had happened. Walker wasn't a thief, not even in the conventional sense, an outlaw. He was a redistributor, an inverted Robin Hood operating in a post-war landscape where the federal government had failed in its most basic obligations to the people it had freed, and where the railroads and cattle barons were seizing every acre and dollar they could get their hands on before anyone could organize effective resistance. Walker was the resistance. By the spring of 1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including 2 more railroad payroll robberies, the looting of a Wells Fargo office in Texarkana, the interception of a cattle herd being driven north to Kansas by speculators who'd cheated Comanche families out of their treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the Bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of 41 $1,000. The bank's records, including the foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to the foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of the dispossessed families, accompanied by notarized statements indicating the bank had reconsidered and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds themselves were genuine, removed from the bank's vault during the robbery, transferred properly through the county recorder's office, using a clerk who'd been bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to cooperate. The federal authorities challenged the deeds in court. The court, presided over by a Reconstruction-era judge sympathetic to the freedmen, ruled the transfers were legal on their face, and the federal government had no standing to contest them. The dispossessed families kept their land. The bank, ruined by the loss in publicity, closed its doors within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading the reports in his Fort Smith office, began to develop what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry, an admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he'd begun to understand why Walker had become a folk hero in the territory, why the songs sung about him by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had spread to cattle camps and railroad work crews, why even some white settlers, particularly small farmers and Confederate veterans ruined by the war, were starting to view Walker not as an outlaw, but as a man taking back some small fraction of what had been stolen from everyone not rich enough to be on the winning side of the new American economy. Donovan understood all that, and he also understood that his job was to capture or kill Jeremiah Walker, and that his job was not negotiable. In the summer of 1869, Donovan made his first serious attempt. He assembled a force of 40 men, 20 Pinkerton agents, 12 Texas Rangers under a notorious captain named Leander McNelly, and 8 federal marshals from Fort Smith, equipped with new Henry repeating rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the best horses the agency could buy. They had intelligence from an informant, a freedman named Cyrus Burdett, who'd briefly ridden with Walker's band and been turned by the offer of a federal pardon and $100,000 in cash. That Walker's main camp was in a hidden valley in the Kiamichi Mountains, called by the Choctaw the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accessible only through a single narrow defile the band kept guarded day and night. Donovan's force rode out from Fort Smith on the morning of June 3, 1869, to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near Tuskahoma, where he'd lead them by a back route into the valley. They reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting, sitting against a tree, hands tied behind his back, throat cut from ear to ear, eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card, the King of Spades. Donovan understood instantly. Burdett had been doubled, pretending to take federal money while reporting everything back to Walker, who'd used him to lure the federal force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men to spread into a defensive perimeter and prepare for an attack. The attack came at moonrise. A 3/4 moon rising late and bright through the pine tops. And the men who survived what happened next would never afterward sit comfortably in a dark forest, hear horses' hooves on pine needles, or smell wood smoke on a summer night without the hair on their arms standing up. It came from every direction at once, from positions the band had clearly prepared days in advance. Crossfires pinning the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in a single breath. Men standing or kneeling in positions they'd thought offered protection. But that had in fact been chosen by the marksmen in the trees, who'd used the federal force's own defensive instincts to guide them into the kill zone. Return fire was wild. The federal men shot at muzzle flashes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, moving between shots, never twice from the same position. Captain McNelly, the notoriously aggressive Texas Ranger, who'd spent 4 years fighting Mexican bandits along the Rio Grande, tried to lead a charge into the timber on the south side of the clearing. He was shot through the neck before he'd taken 5 steps, dying slowly over the next 10 minutes while his men crouched behind fallen logs, unable to help him without drawing the same fire. The voice of Jeremiah Walker himself, or someone speaking for him, called out at one point from the darkness, in English clear enough to carry across the clearing, telling the federal men to lay down their weapons and stand with their hands empty, and they wouldn't be killed. Donovan, bleeding from a shoulder wound that nearly killed him, made a decision he'd second-guess for the rest of his life, and ordered his men to surrender. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 16 of Donovan's 40 men were dead, 12 more wounded. The remainder, including Donovan, were stripped of their weapons, horses, and uniforms, and left to walk the 40 miles back to Fort Smith in their underwear. None of Walker's band, as far as anyone could tell, had been killed or even wounded. When Donovan staggered into Fort Smith 3 days later, sunburned and dehydrated, with a tag pinned to his bare chest, reading the same 5 words that had appeared on the wagon guards a year earlier. Federal Marshal James Fagan sent a telegram to Washington requesting authorization to raise a force of regular Army cavalry, at least a regiment, to clear the territory of what he called, in the language of the time, the Negro Insurrectionary Band, led by the freedman Walker. The War Department's response, when it finally came, was to deny the request. The reasons for the denial wouldn't become clear for another 50 years, when the relevant files were finally opened to historians. The truth, which the War Department understood and James Fagan didn't, was that Jeremiah Walker's operations had become entangled in a much larger political conflict involving the Grant administration's Reconstruction policies, the legal status of freedmen in the Western Territories, and the desperate efforts of railroads and cattle interests to seize control of Indian Territory before any effective federal authority could be established. Sending a cavalry regiment into the territory to hunt a band that included Comanche warriors and was protected by the Choctaw government, would, the War Department feared, trigger exactly the kind of larger Indian war General Sherman was trying to avoid. It would also, less officially but more importantly, draw national attention to the fact that the federal government was failing catastrophically to protect freedmen, in many respects allowing the South to reimpose de facto slavery through the convict lease system. Black codes and rising Klan violence that federal authorities were either unable or unwilling to suppress. Walker was an embarrassment. The cavalry would make him a martyr. Better to let the Pinkertons handle it quietly, out of the public eye, and hope the problem would solve itself through the slow attrition of arrests, betrayals, and natural causes that eventually consumed every outlaw band. This was the policy the Grant administration adopted. Patrick Donovan was instructed to continue his pursuit with whatever resources the agency could provide, and to keep the matter out of the newspapers. Donovan, who'd nearly died in the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accepted his orders with a grim sense of having finally understood the kind of country he was working for. What followed was 3 years of a strange, slow, deeply secret war fought in the canyons, bottoms, and small towns of the territory, the Texas borderlands, and southwestern Arkansas. Walker's band continued to operate, hitting selected targets with surgical precision, never striking the same place twice, never killing more than the operation required, always leaving behind their playing cards and tagged messages. They robbed 2 more bank vaults, 3 more railroad payrolls, an Army quartermaster wagon carrying 60 Zalosen for frontier garrisons, and most spectacularly, in October 1870, attacked and looted a riverboat called the Memphis Belle as it lay tied up at a wood landing on the Arkansas River, taking an estimated the $90 Zalosen in cash and bullion the boat was carrying south for a consortium of New Orleans cotton factors. In each case, the proceeds disappeared into the network of caves, sympathetic farmers, and quietly bribed officials Walker had constructed across 3 states. In each case, within weeks of the robbery, freedmen families, dispossessed Indian families, ruined small farmers, and Mexican families displaced by Anglo cattle barons would receive small, unmarked packages of cash, deeds returned from foreclosure, livestock stolen from them years earlier, and reappearing at their gates with no explanation. Walker had built, in effect, a parallel economy, a redistributive system funded by armed expropriation from the largest concentrations of post-war capital, operated through a network of mutual aid that crossed every line of race, religion, and language in the borderlands. Patrick Donovan understood all of this, and the more he understood, the more he found himself, against his will and orders, beginning to admire the man he'd been sent to destroy. He wrote in his journal, which his granddaughter discovered in an attic in Chicago in 1947, and eventually deposited at the Newberry Library, that Walker was the most dangerous man in America, not because he was killing white people, but because he was demonstrating that an alternative to the developing American economy was possible, and that this alternative could be defended by men and women willing to die for it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Kiamichi country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The thing that finally broke the band. The thing no Pinkerton investigation or federal marshal had been able to accomplish, was something no one had foreseen. It wasn't betrayal, though there had been many attempted betrayals over the years. It wasn't military force, though Donovan continued to assemble and dispatch posses with grim regularity. It was, in the end, a combination of personal grief and strategic miscalculation. The same combination that has destroyed every armed resistance movement in human history, sooner or later. In the spring of 1872, Delia Ransom was pregnant. The father was Jeremiah Walker himself, with whom Delia had been intimate, the records suggest, since at least 1868. Though their relationship had been kept carefully, concealed even from the rest of the band. Both because Walker believed personal attachments made a man vulnerable, and because Delia insisted on operating as an equal commander, not a wife or consort. The pregnancy changed everything. Walker, who'd survived a childhood in slavery, 3 years of war, and 4 years as the most hunted man in the Western Territories, found himself for the first time confronting the possibility of something he'd never allowed himself to imagine: a future, a child, a family. The record suggests he and Delia began in the summer of 1872 to plan their withdrawal from the band. They wouldn't abandon operations entirely, but shift to a quieter role, advisory rather than operational, allowing younger men like Castile Pettigrew and Tabananaka's nephew, a young Comanche warrior named Poitz Quasho, to take over leadership. Walker and Delia would relocate to a small farm in the Choctaw Nation that had been quietly purchased in Solomon Beam's name, where they would try to live out whatever years remained to them as ordinary people. It was a beautiful plan. It was a sentimental plan. It was, as Walker himself probably understood, a plan no man in his position had any right to make. The plan was discovered by Patrick Donovan in October 1872, through a piece of dumb luck so improbable that Donovan himself, in his journal, attributed it to the direct intervention of God, in whom he hadn't previously believed. A Choctaw freedman named Ezekiel Folsom, distantly related to saloon owner Pushmataha Folsom and the Choctaw chief, had been arrested in Fort Smith on horse theft. To save himself from a long sentence, he offered information he'd heard from his cousin, who worked at the recorder's office in Tuskahoma, that a deed had recently been registered for a small farm near the town of Atoka in the name of Solomon Beams. Folsom didn't know who Solomon Beams was, or why this should be valuable. He offered it as part of a list of small gossip bits he hoped would buy his freedom. Donovan, sitting across the desk, recognized the name instantly. He'd seen it in reports for years, mentioned in passing as one of Walker's associates. The deed was the first concrete connection between Walker's band and identifiable fixed property anywhere in the territory. It was a thread. Donovan pulled it. What he found was the entire pattern. The farm at Atoka had been purchased with cash, deposited in a bank in Sherman, Texas, by a freight agent named Augustus Blandon, who'd received the cash from a Choctaw merchant named Cyrus Pitchlin, brother-in-law of Pushmataha Folsom, the saloon owner in Boggy Depot, and principal supplier of whiskey to the Kiamichi Mountains. By following the money, Donovan was able over 3 months to map the entire commercial infrastructure of Walker's network. Every saloon keeper, every freight agent, every bribed clerk, every sympathetic farmer moving supplies and information for the band for the past 4 years. He didn't move on any of them. Instead, he watched, waited, compiled. By February 1873, Donovan had assembled a list of 147 individuals across 3 states and Indian Territory materially involved in supporting Walker's operations, and had identified with reasonable confidence the location of the farm at Atoka where Walker and Delia Ransom planned to retire after the birth of their child. Expected in the late spring, Donovan did something then no Pinkerton agent had done before. He went directly to Alan Pinkerton in Chicago and laid out the entire case. What Walker had built, what the network was and did, why freedmen, Indians, Mexican families, and ruined white farmers were protecting it, and explained that any attempt to destroy the band by force, even with all this intelligence, would create martyrs and harden the network into a permanent insurgency the federal government could never suppress without politically impossible violence. He proposed a different approach. He proposed to make Walker an offer. The offer, as Donovan finally presented it through an intermediary in March 1873, was this: Walker and Delia Ransom could keep the farm at Atoka, their unborn child, and receive federal pardons signed personally by President Grant for all crimes committed by them or any member of the band during their years of operation. In exchange, they'd disband, return to private life, and use their remaining moral authority among the freedmen and Indian peoples to discourage any further organized resistance to the federal government and the developing American economy. They would, in effect, sell out. The intermediary was Solomon Beams, the old Choctaw freedman cook whom Donovan had been holding in protective custody at Fort Smith for 2 months without filing charges. Donovan had treated Beams well, fed him at the marshal's table, allowed him to write to his family, and had explained with patient clarity what would happen to the entire network of 147 people, including Beams's own wife and 3 children, if the offer was rejected. Beams understood. He carried the offer back into the Kiamichi Mountains, delivering it to Walker personally in the Valley of the Whispering Pines on a cold March evening in 1873. What was said between them isn't recorded, because Solomon Beams refused for the rest of his long life to discuss it with any white man, and the only people he ever told the full story to were 3 black ministers in eastern Oklahoma, all of whom died without writing it down. What is known is that Walker accepted. He understood, the way Donovan had hoped he would, that the cost of refusal would be paid not by him, but by everyone who'd stood with him, and that he had no right to ask them to pay that cost for his pride or continued resistance. The plan was set for the night of April 7, 1873. Walker would meet Donovan at a remote cabin near the Texas border, where the formal pardons would be signed and disbandment would begin. Walker would come alone, Donovan would come alone. The agreement was witnessed by Solomon Beams and by a Choctaw judge named Allen Wright. The same Allen Wright who'd been chief when Donovan first investigated the Dokesville murder 5 years earlier, and who'd agreed, after considerable pressure, to serve as guarantor of the federal government's good faith. Walker arrived at the cabin at midnight, April 7, alone on a horse, carrying no weapons. Donovan was waiting. The pardons were signed. The 2 men shared a bottle of whiskey. The first time, Walker remarked, he'd ever drunk with a white lawman. They talked for several hours about the war, the territory, the future. Donovan wrote in his journal that Walker spoke of his unborn child with a softness he hadn't expected from a man who'd killed perhaps 50 others over his career. Walker asked at one point whether Donovan thought the Grant administration would actually honor the pardon, whether it would hold in any court, whether the land at Atoka would remain in his name if some ambitious prosecutor challenged it 5 years from now. Donovan said honestly he didn't know, that he'd done everything within his authority to make the agreement binding, that the pardon bore the president's signature, that Choctaw Judge Allen Wright had agreed to serve as witness and guarantor, but that the U.S. government wasn't in the habit of keeping promises to black men or Indians, and Walker would be a fool to trust any piece of paper from Washington. Walker smiled, a small private smile Donovan would remember for the rest of his life, and said only that he was tired, that he'd been tired for 10 years, and that he'd decided a foolish trust was preferable to the alternative to spending the rest of his life running, raising his child on the run, watching his child grow up, expecting to be killed the way his father and grandfather had been killed. He'd made his peace, with the possibility the pardon wouldn't hold. If it didn't, at least he'd have tried. He was giving up the band not for the farm or the pardons, but for the chance, however small, of a life not defined by the expectation of violence. They parted before dawn. Walker rode north toward the Choctaw Nation and the farm at Atoka, where Delia was waiting. Donovan rode east toward Fort Smith with the signed agreement in his saddlebag. What happened next was something Patrick Donovan hadn't anticipated, and no one in the federal government had anticipated, and it demonstrated, with terrible finality, that the network Walker had built wasn't actually under Walker's control, and perhaps never had been. The 17 men who'd been hunting Walker for the previous 6 weeks. The Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, and federal deputies whose bodies the marshal would find a few weeks later arranged in their perfect circle around a dying campfire, hadn't known about Donovan's negotiation. They were operating under older orders to capture or kill Walker on sight. They'd been close, picked up his trail 2 days before the meeting with Donovan, and had been closing in on the cabin when Walker rode away at dawn. They caught up with him at mid-morning on April 18 in a small ravine about 12 miles south of the Red River in Texas. They surrounded him, demanded surrender. Walker, carrying no weapons, he'd ridden to the meeting unarmed as a gesture of good faith, raised his hands and showed them the signed federal pardon. The POS leader, a Texas Ranger captain named Moriah Hollister, took the pardon, read it, and threw it on the ground. He told Walker he didn't recognize the authority of any pardon issued by the Grant administration. His orders came from the state of Texas and the cattlemen's associations funding his work, and those orders hadn't changed. He gave Walker 30 seconds to draw a weapon and defend himself. Walker, still weaponless, simply stood there. Hollister shot him through the chest from 12 feet. Walker fell. Hollister rode forward, dismounted, and put a second bullet through Walker's head as he lay dying in the dust. He then ordered the body hung from the nearest tree as a warning. The body was hung. The POS rode away. They didn't know what they'd done. They didn't know about the network, about Delia Ransom and the unborn child waiting at the farm in Atoka, about the fact that they'd just executed the only man in 3 states holding back something far older and more dangerous than any organized outlaw band. They found out within 48 hours. Castile Pettigrew was the first to reach the body, alerted by a Comanche scout shadowing Walker as he rode north from the meeting with Donovan. Pettigrew cut the body down, buried it in an unmarked grave in a place never discovered, then sent runners in every direction across the network, carrying no message except a date, a place, and a deck of playing cards from which 17 specific cards had been removed. The remaining members of the band and the inner circle of the support network understood. They knew what was being asked. Within 6 weeks, every man who'd been part of the POS that killed Jeremiah Walker, including Moriah Hollister, had been hunted down and killed. Each shot once between the eyes, each left holding one of the 17 missing playing cards, each arranged in a pattern meaningless to federal investigators who found the bodies, but which, when the cards were eventually combined and read in the order the men died, spelled out in a code based on a Comanche counting system. The simple words, "This debt is paid." Patrick Donovan, when he finally understood what had happened, requested a leave of absence from the Pinkerton agency. He went to Chicago, spent 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel room, wrote a long letter to Alan Pinkerton explaining he was resigning, that he could no longer continue in a profession that had used him, against his knowledge and explicit assurances, to lure a man to his death under the false promise of a federal pardon. Pinkerton refused to accept the resignation, explaining in a private meeting. Donovan recorded in his journal that Moriah Hollister hadn't been operating under federal orders, that his actions were unauthorized and in a strict legal sense a state crime, and the federal government couldn't be held responsible. Donovan understood this was true in the narrowest legal sense and false in every meaningful sense. He understood the federal government had created the conditions under which Hollister could believe his orders hadn't changed. By failing to communicate the pardon to field operatives, failing to coordinate the various agencies hunting Walker, failing fundamentally to want Walker to live. He understood Walker had been killed not by Hollister, who merely fired the bullets, but by the United States government, which had decided an alternative American economy couldn't be allowed to exist. He stayed at the agency because he had nowhere else to go and a family to support. But he never worked another case in the territory and never spoke to Allen Pinkerton again except through subordinates. He died in 1907 in Chicago of pneumonia, age 73. His last words, according to his daughter present at the bedside, were the name Jeremiah, repeated twice. What happened to Delia Ransom and the child? To the network of 147 people who'd supported Walker for 5 years? To the farm at Atoka where Walker had hoped to live as an ordinary man? The answers survive in pieces, in family histories, oral traditions of freedmen, Choctaw, and Comanche, but have never been fully assembled and probably never will be. Delia Ransom gave birth to a son in May 1873, naming him Jeremiah after his father. She left the Choctaw Nation within a month, traveling first to New Orleans, then by ship to Liberia, where a small community of black expatriates from the American South had been attempting for 50 years to build a free republic on the west coast of Africa. She arrived in Monrovia in November 1873, living under the name Delia Walker until her death in 1904. Her son grew up in Liberia. Educated at the College of West Africa, became a lawyer, and eventually returned to the United States in the 1910s, becoming one of the early organizers of what would become the NAACP. He died in 1949 in Atlanta, having lived an entire life without publicly acknowledging his father's identity. Though he wrote in a private letter to his own son that he'd been told the story at age 12 by his mother and carried it with him every day thereafter, the network of 147 people was never prosecuted. Donovan, in his last act of conscience as a Pinkerton agent, destroyed the list, burned it himself in the fireplace of his hotel room in Chicago the week after learning of Walker's death. The names existed nowhere else. The men and women on the list lived out their lives in towns and farms across the territory, and the support they'd given Walker remained for most of them a secret, shared only with children and grandchildren. In private late at night, when the white world wasn't listening, the farm at Atoka was burned to the ground in 1875 by night riders associated with the early Ku Klux Klan, who'd heard rumors it had once belonged to Walker and wished to make a statement. The rumors were never confirmed. The land was sold for taxes in 1878 to a white settler from Kansas who had no idea what he was buying. The settler, Ebenezer Crowley, found when he plowed the south field for the first spring planting a small leather pouch buried 6 inches below the surface. Inside were 20 gold double eagles, the last of the Choctaw annuity gold from the robbery of 1868, which Walker had buried on the farm he'd hoped to live on, perhaps as insurance, perhaps simply from the habit of a man who'd spent his life expecting everything could be taken from him at any moment. Crowley sold the gold to a bank in Atoka, used the money to buy a team of mules, and lived a long, uneventful life on the land where Jeremiah Walker had hoped to raise his son, never knowing what he'd stumbled onto. He died in 1909, having mentioned the gold to no one but his wife. The story of Jeremiah Walker, the runaway slave who built the most dangerous gang the Western Territories had ever seen, was systematically suppressed by the federal government. The Pinkerton Agency, the cattle interests who profited from his death, and the dominant historical narrative of the American West, which had no place for a black man on horseback with a Spencer carbine and a network of 147 people across 3 states willing to die to protect him. The story survived in fragments. In songs black families in eastern Oklahoma still sing without quite knowing what they mean, in playing cards that occasionally appear in antique markets in Fort Smith and Texarkana, with strange numerical markings on their backs, in a small obelisk in a forgotten cemetery in the Choctaw Nation that bears name, but is decorated every April 18 with a single bouquet of wild prairie flowers, placed there by hands never seen, and after 150 years must belong to the great-grandchildren of people who knew the truth and refused to let it die. This mystery shows us that the history we're taught is rarely the history that actually happened, and that the most dangerous men in any society aren't those who kill and steal for personal gain, but those who refuse to accept the world as they find it is the only world that can exist. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Jeremiah Walker an outlaw, a hero, or something more complicated than either word can capture? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next one.